The Tongshan Biota has just been described as a Burgess Shale-type fossil deposit from the very latest Precambrian. This is something paleontologists have been dying to see for a long, long time. So, does it live up to expectations? Does it tell us what we want to know, or does it just deepen the mysteries? Let's go and have a close look and find out. If I say the words terminal Ediacaran Burgess Shale-type fauna, a lot of you, well, some of you will know exactly why that is important. A lot of you won't though. So I'm going to have to give a little bit of introduction to this first, and you very soon will, so don't worry about it. So the Cambrian Explosion is still one of the deepest mysteries in paleontology. It's been known since the days of Darwin that there were problems interpreting how the origin of animals came about, because what he saw at that time was a sudden appearance of many different fossil groups, recognisable groups of animals, in the early part and the middle part of the Cambrian period. But before that, in his time, there was nothing. There was no precursor to these animals, they just appeared spontaneously in the fossil record. That has changed dramatically in the last 150 years. We now have an enormous number of fossils from Precambrian rocks, especially the latest part of it, which is called the Ediacaran. But these fossils are still mysterious. They don't tie in very neatly with modern groups of animals, for example. Many of them are clearly algae and things like that, but many others are just strange, sort of frond-like and quilted organisms that have been debated for, well, since they were discovered. There is a general consensus that these are probably animals in some sense, and I'll do a separate video about the Cambrian Explosion and the basics of it, explaining why we have to be very careful when we say the word animals, and we have to state exactly what we mean by that. But think of them for this one as relatives of modern living animals. The problem is that we can't put them easily into modern groups. You have to really squeeze them in. And yet, in the Cambrian, most of the fossils that we find, we can assign to modern phyla, or at least being closely related to the modern phyla, the major divisions of animal life. So mollusks, or annelid worms, or chordates, or whatever it is. But in the Precambrian, we should see lots of things that we can sort of hopefully quite easily assign to these living phyla, but we don't really see that. There are a few exceptions which a lot of people accept as cnidarians, for example, but mostly they are a bit separate from everything else. So what we really hope to see is a deposit, a fossil deposit, from the very latest part of the Precambrian, which shows the precursors of the things we find in the early Cambrian, things which are very clearly on their way to being an arthropod, or a priapulid worm, or an echinoderm, things which are recognisable, and we can slot them into place without too much argument. So, the ideal fossil deposits for working out this sort of thing are what we call the Burgess Shale-type faunas. And these are very well known from the Cambrian, and now from the Ordovician to some extent as well. But from the Cambrian they give us a wonderful window into the aftermath of the Cambrian Explosion. So after things have diversified into the major groups, we have these deposits from around the world that preserve everything, basically, down to sort of millimetre scale at least. And when I say everything, I mean whatever it was, soft-bodied or not, often with exquisite detail, including internal organs, nervous systems, that sort of stuff. And we have these extraordinary fossil deposits that preserve soft-bodied organisms flattened onto mudstone as carbon films. And that was a window that was very wide open in the Cambrian. We have this preservation quite widely. But what we really want to see is that in the late Ediacaran, just before the Cambrian Explosion seems to have got going properly, and try to understand from that where these precursors are. because we still have this problem that the Cambrian explosion shows the diversification of recognisable groups of animals. In the Ediacaran, we now have abundant fossil deposits of all sorts of extraordinary creatures, some of which may be at least related to animals, most of which may be, but we can't tie them to living groups. So, when you hear the words that we have a Burgess shale-type fauna from the terminal Ediacaran of China, we get very excited. This is 100 years of mystery about to be solved, hopefully. So the paper is published in Nature Communications, which is open access. The authors will have had to pay quite a lot for that, but it's open access, so you can go and look at it yourself. The link's in the description. And it's by Ho Jinbo and colleagues from Nanjing, together with Jahanda Ramazani from MIT, Massachusetts Institute of Technology. And it's a relatively short format paper, as they always are, so it is much more of an announcement of the discovery than it is a really deep dive into all the details. That's just the nature of this sort of paper. That this is telling the world that it exists, and in future papers they will do much more fine detail. But still, there should be enough here to really get our teeth into. And there's supporting information as well, which includes more photographs and so on. So, first things first is the background. It's in South China. It's in the Dongying Formation, which is a well-known deposit that is around the very latest Ediacaran, going into the base of the Cambrian. And this is quite a small thickness. It's something like, was it 60 metres, I think it was? Yeah, something like, oh no, it's only about 20 metres thick. So it's quite a thin deposit by Burgess shale-type fauna standards, although compare that with Castlebank at 20 centimetres, and 20 metres sounds like an awful lot. So we have 20 metres of mudstone interspersed into a chert sequence. This is a very silicious rock that's mostly precipitating from the seawater, which was quite common during the Ediacaran. And so the sediment is being washed in from shallower, more aerobic conditions, and then buried in this area, which locally was anoxic, at least in part, so we have things like pyrite crystals growing in it. And this is absolutely typical for a Burgess shale-type fauna. This is exactly how they normally form, that they go from shallow aerobic conditions into deeper anaerobic conditions, and that is part of the process that preserves them. The fossils are carbon films with a bit of calcium phosphate and a bit of pyrite as well, which is all great. That's a perfect combination of different mineral types. So it looks like an absolutely classic Burgess shale-type preservation assemblage. In terms of the age, it's not brilliantly well constrained. They have dates from ash beds above and below, which narrow it down to between 543 and 551 million years. And it looks like it's more towards the top of the interval than the bottom, for what you can tell, because sedimentation rates vary. But you would expect this to be somewhere around, based on that, something like 547 to 545 million years, which is right at the end of the Ediacaran. The base of the Cambrian is now dated at about 538.8 million years. This gives you a bit of clearance. It's definitely in the Precambrian, but it is still very, very late. And if such things as the various phyla of worms and arthropods and all sorts were around at the base of the Cambrian, then they should also be here at this time, at least their ancestral forms that have close similarity to them. Great. So let's have a look at what they've got. First of all, they have lots and lots of algae. And these are finely branching, sometimes filamentous things, sometimes stringy little strands. But most of these they can assign to known genera or even species of algae from other Precambrian deposits, Ediacaran deposits of China. Because this is not the only Burgess shale-type assemblage that we have at this time, or at least in the Ediacaran. There are other deposits like the Miaohe Biota, the Lantian. Mostly these are significantly older than the Tongshan, but still, we have these comparative assemblages. And a lot of these algae that they're finding are actually pretty much the same as you get in places like the Miaohe Biota, which is interesting. It's not the most promising start because this looks like it's the sort of thing that you get as a typical Ediacaran assemblage rather than a typical Cambrian one. Okay, moving on. There are also some much later Ediacaran things. Tubes, for example, called protoconites, which have been widely assigned to cnidarians without any real certainty, but that's most likely based on similarity to other tubes made by cnidarians, such as jellyfish and sea anemones and that sort of thing. And this is one of the earliest branching groups of animals, and it's the best documented in any Ediacaran deposits of a phylum, a living phylum that is still preserved at this time. There are also weird things like Palaeopachicnus, which is a standard Ediacaran mystery. Nobody knows quite what that is. Possibly a rhizarian protist or something like that, but we're not sure. And other anomalies like the fabulous Eoandromeda, which is an eightfold sort of Catherine wheel-like symmetry of radiating structures. And we have this in multiple different preservational styles in different deposits. It has been called a ctenophore, but the evidence for that is pretty sketchy. And yeah, we're not quite sure what these things are. But they are very typical late Ediacaran assemblages. What else do we have then? Well, another of the absolutely typical late Ediacaran fossils, or groups of fossils, are what we call fronds of various sorts. Rangeomorphs is a technical term. But these are things like Chania, Chaniodiscus, all sorts of other ones which are vaguely similar. They have what appears to be a circular holdfast, a little stalk, and then something that looks like a sea pen. And the modern sea pens are cnidarians, and it has been shown by work on the growth patterns of these things that they are not sea pens. They're not closely related to them, they're probably not cnidarians, but superficially they look similar. But they seem to have worked in a different way, and they are, if anything, the archetypal Ediacaran type fossil. They occur all over the world from about 600 million years, back down to the Cambrian boundary almost. So we have a wide range of these as well, including unnamed forms, so things which are new species, which is great, it's what you'd expect, but there are some new ones there. But the difference with normal is that usually we see these as relatively poor resolution moulds in sandstones. This is how they're usually fossilised in the Ediacaran. I'll do videos about this sort of stuff in future because it's really weird fossilisation. But it doesn't give us a really fine detail. So these carbonaceous compression fossils in very fine mud actually preserve much more detail potentially. And it looks, from what they're showing here, that we are seeing more detail. There are fine structures that we don't normally get, and this is important. This is going to help us interpret how these things were structured, how they lived, and hopefully what they're related to. At least, you never know. In the supporting information, there's also a fragmentary specimen that they're assigning to Cynospongia. As you might guess, this was originally thought to be a sponge, or described as one. It's since been discounted effectively. It doesn't show any sponge features, but this fragment has little organic fibres in various orientations. It doesn't look like sponge, it's probably just an alga with fibrous bits in it, but it's a little bit ambiguous as to what this is. But it's yet again another Miaohe type, earlier Ediacaran member of this assemblage. So there was I poring over the pictures all the way through the manuscript, looking for some definite animals, things that really look like worms, or something that might even be crunchy. And there isn't anything. Everything they've got is absolutely typical Ediacaran-like assemblage. Now, the paper uses the term animal quite freely, so it refers to all these frond-like creatures as animals regularly, which is very much an assumption, although if you include the stem group of animals, as I'll talk about in another video, this gives you an awful lot of leeway as to what you call an animal. So, in terms of things which are members of recognisable animal groups, which the molecular clocks tell us should have diversified by this time, we're really not seeing anything of that nature here, apart from these possible cnidarians, which are already known at this sort of age. So, this is really interesting and slightly disappointing in some perspectives, because at this age, with this preservation, which looks absolutely stunning, it's lovely preservation, we would expect, if there were animals as a widespread component of this ecosystem, by which I mean bilaterians, for example, things which have evolved bilateral symmetry, movement, a gut, that sort of stuff, we would expect to find them in this deposit, unless there is some reason why they would not be here. So we can go through a few possible reasons. One is that perhaps this environment had too low oxygen to preserve them. The problem is that we're getting a diverse array of other fossils, and the type of preservation is absolutely typical in terms of the environmental context, the deposition from shallower, more oxygenated water into anoxic sediment. Everything is absolutely typical for Burgess Shale-type preservation. If you compare their polished section, vertical section through these beds, with, for example, Castle Bank, it basically looks the same. It's almost identical sedimentologically. There is no reason from this to think that there was something like an anoxic exclusion of organisms that required more oxygen. Because if that was the case, we wouldn't be getting animals in the Cambrian faunas either. So we have no reason to think that that is a valid excuse. I mean, it's just possible that a lot of these things were living on the very extreme fringes of low oxygenation, and for some reason more mobile animals couldn't cope with that. And we're not seeing any sampling in this sediment that's being brought in of the more aerobic bits, but it's a bit of a stretch because there's no sign of that. It's basically trying to explain it away without any evidence. Then we have the possibility that maybe, for some reason, animals are not being preserved. Maybe the preservation isn't as good as we think it is, because maybe these organisms were much softer than the things that were fossilised. But we're getting beautiful preservation of algae. We're getting things like Eoandromeda and the fronds, with very fine detail in the fronds, and that's important. We're not just getting a large lump of rubbery carbon or something like that that has been deposited and buried and turned to kerogen. This is really fine detail of soft-bodied organisms. If they're preserved, then worms and so on should also be. Maybe animals had diversified at this time, but were tiny? Does that make any sense? It's something that has been suggested repeatedly before, and we'll come back to this again in future videos, I'm sure. But one of the main problems is that in the Cambrian, including the early Cambrian, the animals are large across the board. It's not just one or two large groups. It's even things which are tiny today. We have much larger early relatives preserved in Xinjiang, for example. So there's no evidence pointing to that either. And in that case, you would have to have a sudden, an extreme enlargement of every group of animals into the Cambrian, and then a reduction in size of many of them afterwards. And again, it's clutching at straws. We have no evidence that there were minute, microscopic precursors of the modern lineages of animals at this time. So, if you take this all at face value, and without resorting to something like, well, the animals evolved in one particular continent, which isn't South China, and they hadn't spread around the world yet. Again, theoretically possible, we've got no evidence for it. So if you discount that sort of argument, and you take this at face value, then what you're left with is that at this point, maybe between 5 and 10 million years before the base of the Cambrian, we have nothing that looks like the modern phyla of animals except for possible cnidarians and very dodgy ctenophores. Only these very earliest groups of animals are possibly represented. There is nothing that looks like a bilaterian here at all. And this is something we would expect to see. The thing is, it's not just here. This was so far probably our best chance to find these bilaterians that should be everywhere according to many molecular clock analyses, for example, and most current thinking that the animals must have diversified by this time, because otherwise you have a very explosive Cambrian explosion. So this was our best chance to show that, and it hasn't. That's really, really interesting. Because although it's a lack of evidence, it's a lack of evidence in a place where you would expect to see evidence. So if you take this purely at sort of face value, then you might say this actually constrains the diversification of recognisable bilaterians to after this time. You can't go that far because this is one site and we don't know all the details about the environment and what was living around it. But if you were to take that, then this is potentially weak evidence at least that you're constraining that diversification to after this time, which would be extraordinary. And we'll come back to all of the arguments around this in future videos. But I think for this one I will leave it there, because it is a really interesting deposit. The authors have done a really good job describing at least the outline of what's there and how it's preserved. It's a nice paper, I like it. And it has shown us that we don't have what we might hope to have under these conditions. It's not alone in that. It's another bit of evidence which to me is pointing increasingly towards an extremely rapid and abrupt Cambrian explosion of at least most of the groups of living animals. Yeah, food for thought, definitely. Okay, well, I shall come back to this shortly. I'm planning the next video will probably be an introduction to the various aspects of the Cambrian explosion, what we don't understand, what we do understand, and what the evidence is pointing towards at this stage. So it should be quite a fun one. It'll be a sort of primer for a lot of people who aren't really intimately knowledgeable about this area, and hopefully will help to make sense of a lot of other things. So once you understand what the Cambrian explosion appears to be, how it fits in with our knowledge of the fossil record, then it gives a lot more significance to interpretations of other organisms, so possible sponges and so on. But go and have a look at the paper. It's a really nice one. Obviously it's quite technical, but you'll probably be able to get quite a bit out of it. So enjoy. And thank you to Igloo Phylogeny for pointing this out to me. I almost forgot to say. I hadn't seen this covered very widely in the public sort of media, in the popular media. So it's quite odd. This is almost gone under the radar, but it's potentially a very important paper. And yeah, so thank you. And yeah, let's see what turns up next. All right, bye for now.